Yeah, Brian was focused. He would get an idea and he would fully develop it in his mind from beginning to end, and he could see the whole picture, and he would immediately act upon it. This is my opinion of what Brian's genius was. It was his ability to conceive a song, put it together in his head, act on it immediately, whether it be in the middle of the night or in the morning, whenever. He would act on it immediately and see it through from beginning to end. And it was really quite something to watch. Well, it was both. Sometimes the songwriting process with Brian Wilson was something where he would be, first of all, he was under pressure with Capitol Records. He was under contract to produce a certain amount of material in a certain amount of time. So as a result, we did a tremendous amount of material in just a couple of years. We did 3-4 albums in a 2.5-year period, something like that. And he would get the idea. He would see a cuckoo clock on the wall and say, I'm going to write a song about a cuckoo clock. And then on the other hand, let's say one day he was in the den, in the music room, and he just picked up the bass and started doing a little bass riff and looked at Carl and I and said, hey, is that cool? Let's write an instrumental around this bass line, which ended up being the song Stoked. So that was an involvement with the rest of us. It was sort of a group effort to put that instrumental together. Same with like a lot of that stuff on the Surfin' USA album, which was half instrumental. We would do, for example, Surf Jam was just done right there on the spot in the studio. And so the writing process took different shapes, different avenues. Brian, as a result of having his music conceived in his head and the full picture before going in the studio, just by virtue of that, made him the producer. He knew what he wanted, he heard it in his head, and he was the one that could get the sound. Now at Western United, where we first recorded our demos, Brian was fully in charge. He had an engineer who was very adept and in tune with Brian. On the other hand, at Capitol Records, when we started recording in their big studio, Brian and Nick Venet had pretty much a feud going on. Nick would interfere with Brian's creative process. He was technically, his title was producer, but in those days, he was more like an executive producer. He was an A&R guy. He wasn't very handy in the studio with the creative process, although he tried to interfere. They worked it out, though. Brian was able to work around that, and Nick just sort of took the back seat when he realized that Brian had it under control. And he was identified as the producer on the album credits, but again, that's like executive producer. Brian was the creative producer. First of all, we'd get to the studio and set up our stuff. The engineer would get a sound on each individual instrument, and then we would record the music track first. Two guitars, bass, and drums. Occasionally, Mike would do a couple of notes on the sax, on a couple of the instrumentals, and on Shutdown he played during the solo. So Brian would be in the studio, in the control room with the engineer most of the time during that, and then he would come out and join us on the bass. And leave Murray in there alone with the engineer, which created a problem because Murray, of course, was creative, fancied himself as a producer also, and thus a feud between Brian and Murray. They were always, fighting over the sound. For example, Murray really preferred a really trebly sound on the guitars, so when Brian left, he would get the sound, leave the control room, come in to play with us. Murray would switch the sounds on the guitars, which would kind of screw up Brian's process. So there were some feuds about that. But I must say, I think Brian should have been left in total control, but Murray did contribute, I believe, to the sound. But those guitars they came out really trebly after all, which, sold a lot. I mean, it appealed. When you heard that first drum beat on Surf Safari coming on over the radio, it was exciting. And those guitars really cut through. And ironically, I think Murray was responsible for that.